Is this? I'm going to have to use the microphone just because we are streaming. I want to thank everyone for coming out today. And for those of you who are joining us via the live stream this morning. Before I introduce Dr. STREAM-Dewey, I do want to say that during the spring, Dr. Dewey will be doing a presentation adapted for the 5th grade students in both of our elementary schools. Ms. Bias is finalizing those dates now, so the communications will go out soon about that. And Dr. Dewey did present to 6th, 7th, and 8th graders at the middle school in November, and then presented for our 9th through 12th graders here at the high school in December. Again, the presentations are adapted somewhat for the target audience, but today he's really going to focus on discussing this through the lens of parents and caregivers in the household. Dr. STREAM-Dewey has been coming here to Roslyn for now about 8 years. We did take a little bit of a gap for various reasons, but we felt that it was imperative that he come this year to meet not only with the parents, but also with the students as well. And his experience in the work that he does is incredible. He has many caseloads of working with students of all ages and young adults and adults. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Dr. Dewey, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Well, thank you for letting me spend some time with you. So my name is Stephen. I'm a psychiatrist, an addiction psychiatrist actually. Have been studying the disease of addiction for almost 45 years. I run the Addiction Research Center at NYU. It's a research center we set up many years ago to study this disease. And the goal is to understand the disease from a science perspective and to educate people about the disease. We know that the single greatest predictor for treatment efficacy for any disease is education. So the goal is to educate people about the disease. And that's my goal today. I'm coming from the science side. So all the science we're going to talk about has been published. You can read it. You can go online and read the actual papers. We're not going to talk about anything that isn't been published, that hasn't gone through the peer review process. So I'm going to come to you like I did with the kids. I'll bring it up a little bit. You can ask any questions you want. I've been doing this for a really long time. But before I begin, I just want to bring you up to date on some of the things that we're seeing. So our center is in the city, and it's a center that's designed to study the disease in every form it takes, whether it's chemical dependency or behavioral addictions. We'll talk about those as well. But in the last couple years, there's been a really big phase shift in what we're seeing in the center. I used to be able to say that I've never lost a patient smoking pot. Now, I've had patients who got high smoking pot, drove their car into a bridge, and lost their life that way, but never as a consequence of the drug itself, until about 2 years ago. Now I lose 12 kids an hour to fentanyl-laced pot. Half of my losses are to kids who aren't smoking it. They're in the room with someone who is. They're dying from secondhand smoke. There's something called the inverse rule in this business, and that's the younger you are, the more lethal the compound. So, someone smoking pot who's 18, a high school senior smoking pot that has fentanyl in it, breathes out, and the 7th grader sitting next to him dies. Because the toxicity of these compounds is inversely related to age. The younger you are, the more toxic the compound. So a high school senior who's getting high on fentanyl-laced pot gets high. But the 5th grader or the 6th grader or the 8th grader who's in the room with him, it's fatal. So we're now seeing 12 deaths an hour, half of which are in kids who aren't using. They're just in the room. They're just there. I had a 22-year-old male patient, he'd been a patient for a while, and he was vaping. And his vape cartridge contained fentanyl, right? So we're seeing a huge increase in the amount of contaminated vapes. He took a hit on his vape, and his 3-year-old son lost his life. He was charged with manslaughter because he claimed he didn't know that there was fentanyl in it, so there was no willful intent. But the point is a simple one. The game has changed. We used to lose 8 patients an hour. All 8 were using the substance. Now it's 12 an hour, and half of them aren't using. They're just in the room. So it's something we're trying to educate people about, this contamination. You're seeing it in the news all the time. Just recently, right, kilos of fentanyl in Nassau County. Right? Fentanyl has gotten to be very easy to make and is becoming more and more prevalent. We're seeing more and more of it. So we've seen it obviously in pot. The number 1 contaminant in pot today is methamphetamine. We'll talk about that. Number 2 is fentanyl. We're seeing it in ecstasy or Molly, cocaine. We're seeing it in vapes. Now, the vape thing hit about 1.5 years ago, where people were buying sealed pods for their vapes. And somehow fentanyl is finding its way into those pods. And when kids are vaping, they're getting fentanyl, right? We have to always remember the secondhand drug effect. Any compound you're using smoking, the secondhand smoke produces the same effect, right? So if you're getting high, you're smoking pot in a room, and someone's in the room with you, the person smoking pot's getting the highest dose, but the kid sitting next to him is getting the next highest dose. And if the drugs are contaminated, which they are, then the kid in the room is getting the second highest dose. Right, so it's just something to be aware of. We're seeing it now every day in our center. We didn't used to see it, but now it's absolutely changed the game for us, where we're losing half of our patients who aren't even using a substance. They're just in the room. So just a heads up, we've been trying to educate kids about this. The contamination thing is getting worse and worse because fentanyl is getting cheaper and cheaper and easier to make. It's colorless, odorless, and tasteless. So we're always recommending, or I'm always recommending, that you can go out and you can buy test strips. Dwayne Reed was giving them away for free. I don't know if they still are. But you can buy fentanyl test strips. And we're encouraging people to at least, at the very least, get these test strips to test your product to see if there's fentanyl in it. It's really simple, it's very sensitive, it's reproducible, it's consistent, and it works. So we've been encouraging people to buy these fentanyl test strips or get them. I don't know if they're still free from Dwayne Reed. They used to be. So with that said, I thought what I would do is show you what I showed kids in this district, and again, raise it up a little bit, and if you have questions, ask. So everybody who comes to my center is a volunteer. Our youngest patients are 4th graders. They're 9 years old, they're alcoholics, and they're drinking a quart of gin or vodka a day. They're alcoholics. Our oldest patients are in their 80s using methamphetamine. So everybody who comes is a volunteer suffering from some kind of addiction, either chemical or behavioral, and we'll talk about both. You're all familiar with the conventional imaging techniques that are out there, CT, X-ray, and MRI. These are basically cameras, fancy cameras that exist in every hospital. And they take pictures of our anatomy, what we look like. But every disease in the human condition represents a change in how your body lives, not how it looks. Right? The alcoholic doesn't look any different than the non-alcoholic, and the Alzheimer's patient doesn't look any different than the non-Alzheimer's. So anatomical imaging is useful, but it's not that useful. It shows us diseases when they're advanced, but it doesn't show us diseases in the beginning. So we need to see a disease before patients get sick. Right? I want to see your cancer before you're symptomatic, and we'll show you exactly what we mean. The tool we use to do this is called a PET scanner, PET, the acronym, positron emission tomography. It's a functional imaging technique. It takes pictures of how your body lives, not what it looks like. So, PET scans are really simple to read. This is a single slice of a human brain. Eyes are on top. This is the back of the brain. And we just look at colors. The color scale we use is the rainbow scale, Roy G. Biv. Parts of the brain that appear red are functionally very active, means they're doing a lot. Parts that are yellow and green, less active. Parts that are violet and black, not active at all. So you get the point. PET scans show us how your body lives. The power of that is that every disease in the human condition is the consequence of the change in how you live, not what you look like. So, PET scans allow us to see diseases in people before they're sick. We see Alzheimer's disease in 17-year-old kids. That's a disease that isn't going to show up for 50 years, 60 years, but we see it. We see the disease of addiction as well. I'll show you. We know a lot about this disease now, and we'll go through all the newest stuff just so you get a sense of what we're talking about. 3 PET scans in 3 normal people, obviously really different. On the far left is a 5-day-old baby. Now I put a baby in there because I speak in elementary schools all the time. And invariably some kid will tell me that they remember the day they were born. Now you and I know that's bullshit, right? No one can remember the day they were born. Your brain doesn't even have the ability to encode a memory. In the middle is our son when he was 6. 6-year-olds have really active brains. And to the right is a high school senior, 17 or 18-year-old kid. The point is a simple one. As we age, our brain changes. That means a lot, but in the science world, it means that I have to control for that. So when I look at a 9-year-old alcoholic, I have to compare that to a 9-year-old who isn't. And when I look at a 15-year-old cocaine abuser, I have to compare it to a 15-year-old who isn't. So all the images you're going to see are compared against someone the same age and the same sex. Addiction is a very different disease in women than it is in men. It's more common in women, progresses faster in women, and it's more difficult to manage in women. To put this in perspective, we know that the disease of addiction is the most lethal disease on the planet. More people die as a consequence of addiction than every other disease combined. Number 1 cause of cancer is addiction. Number 1 cause of heart disease is addiction. Number 1 cause of diabetes is addiction. There's no mystery to this. If we could successfully manage addiction, we'd have a greater impact on human health than managing every other disease combined. So that's the impact that this disease has. So we need to understand it from the chemical perspective as well as the behavioral perspective. Okay, if you've never seen a PET scanner, there's a PET scanner. Not terribly impressive, obscenely expensive, but not terribly impressive. Okay. The disease of addiction, I'll show you exactly what it is the consequence of a change in a chemical in our brain called dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that your brain is making 24/7. Every second of your life, your brain is pumping out dopamine. Dopamine's primary role in our bodies is movement. We have 3 different types of muscles. We have striated muscle, cardiac, our heart, and smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is the muscle that surrounds blood vessels, allows you to vasoconstrict and dilate. Those muscles are controlled by dopamine. Every time you move, and you're moving all the time, right? Your heart's beating, you're expanding your chest to breathe, your eyes are blinking, you're always making dopamine. If you lose dopamine for any reason, traumatic brain injury, age, disease, any reason, addiction, you'll have trouble moving. That disease is called Parkinson's. If you've ever seen a Parkinson's patient, most of the kids, actually not anymore. It used to be that most of the kids remember Muhammad Ali. Now they don't. But you guys remember Muhammad Ali. At the end of his life, he couldn't even speak. Right? He did a 60 Minutes interview with Ed Bradley. He couldn't speak. Now we're seeing patients like Mike Fox. We're seeing Neil Diamond, right? His show on Broadway. He's got his Parkinson's disease is pretty advanced. I was very lucky. I got to spend an afternoon last year with Linda Ronstadt. She can barely speak anymore because her disease is so advanced. So we've all seen cases of Parkinson's disease. It's a disease characterized by a loss of brain dopamine where patients have difficulty moving. Dopamine is also the chemical that allows you to feel happy or sad. We'll make this really simple. When you experience a natural reward, being with your kid, your spouse, a sunny day, a meal that you like, a movie you like, being with your friends, whatever, the reason you feel happy is because that natural reward increased your brain dopamine. When dopamine levels go up, you feel happy. When they go down, you feel sad. Not to be confused with serotonin for depression. Depression is mood. We're talking about acute happiness and sadness. So I always make the same analogy. We're in a school. If your kid gets a 95 on a test, they're happy. That produced an increase in dopamine on the order of 4%, maybe 5%. The most your dopamine will move around a given mean is 4 or 5%, no more. Because if it goes up 8 or 9%, you're schizophrenic. And if it goes down 8 or 9%, you're Parkinsonian. So your dopamine, our dopamine, moves 4 or 5%. That's it. Let's say that kid who gets a 95 wants to celebrate their performance on the test and takes a shot of tequila. Kid's 17 years old. Drinks the tequila, their dopamine goes up about 4,500%. 4%'s normal, 5%'s a lot, but a shot of alcohol, 4,500% in a 17-year-old kid. If the kid is 12 and does the same shot, their dopamine goes up about 28,000%. And if the kid's in 4th grade, about 50,000%. The younger you are, the greater the increase, which means the younger you are when you start using, the higher the probability you'll become addicted. Okay, but let's say instead of alcohol, the kid decides to celebrate with methamphetamine, the #1 contaminant in pot. If you're smoking pot today, you're getting meth. Right, that's the compound that he was making in Breaking Bad, right? Remember the show Breaking Bad? He was making meth. So, if the kid celebrates with meth, now it goes up 1.3 to 1.5 million%. Normal's 4. Methamphetamine, 1.5 million. So we can start to put together what's called a dose-response curve, which means we can look at every addictive drug at every age level and determine what effect we're going to see. Drugs that raise it 1,000,000 times, like meth, are more addictive than drugs that raise it 100 times, like caffeine. So, the addictive liability of compounds, or how addictive a compound is directly related to its impact on dopamine. Heroin raises it 600 to 800,000%. Cocaine, 200 to 400,000. Heroin's more addictive than cocaine. Methamphetamine, 1.5 million, more addictive than heroin and cocaine. So the point is a simple one. We know how addictive drugs work. There's no mystery to it. It's not controversial. It's drug-specific, dose-specific, person or sex in non-specific. Any compound that raises dopamine more than 4 or 5% is addictive, period. Simple. Okay, so because we have this technology with PET, we can look at dopamine. We now have a way to non-invasively, safely, reproducibly look at your dopamine in real time. This is about 3,000 volunteers, high school kids, average age is about 17. That's dopamine in their brain. Pretty simple. Dopamine exists in 2 parts of your brain called your corpus striatum. Name doesn't matter. That's where it is. So we can put you in a camera in 8 minutes, non-invasively, tell you how much dopamine you have. Right? We couldn't do this when I was in medical school. This is the newest technology. We used to, in the old days, do spinal taps. Stick a needle into a spine, pull out CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, and measure a breakdown product of dopamine called homovanillic acid and extrapolate. Well, it was BS back then, it's BS today. Now we look at dopamine in real time. In the brain, not in CSF, not in some liquid dopamine. So we can measure it. So what we do is we go out and we get these kids and we bring them to our center and we measure their dopamine. Simple, easy, safe, non-invasive. Then in this case, we gave them a shot glass of vodka, they drank it, and we watched their dopamine go up. So we now have a tool that allows us to see in real time what happens to the brain dopamine system in response to an addictive substance. So we can take anybody, whether they have the disease, don't have the disease, have recovered from the disease, are continuing to use, and we can see their dopamine status. So we can tell how advanced the disease is, how fast it's spreading, meaning progressing, how long they've been abstinent. We have this unique ability now to look at the disease from every angle. And that's what we do. So, we can make some statements. We now know that about 94% of people who get addicted to something were born with the disease. This is a disease you're born with. The youngest patient we've seen it in is a 3-year-old. What's the importance of this? It says something that we need to kind of convince a lot of people. You would think that this being the most lethal disease in the world, we'd be spending a lot of time educating about it. Or we'd be spending a lot of time educating healthcare professionals about it. When I was in medical school, I got nothing on addiction. I teach in the medical school at NYU, they get 3 hours in 4 years of the most lethal disease. The reason is because we're still waging this war against the disease model. Many people still feel it's not a disease. They think it's a character flaw, a moral weakness, bad parenting. Right. The fact of the matter is this is an organic brain disease you were born with. I'm going to show it to you. What we know about it is it gets unmasked as a consequence of behavior. Now, as soon as you say that, people say, yeah, see, they did it to themselves. But let's take a step back. Number one addiction in the world today is food. Everybody on the planet eats. So everybody on the planet engages in the most common behavior associated with the most common addiction. But only a fraction of people get addicted. That means there's something unique to the brains of people who get addicted, right? We all engage in the most common addictive behavior, every one of us, but only a fraction of us get addicted. That means there's something unique to those people. And I'll show you exactly what it is. So, we know a lot of things. We know that the disease has to be organic. That means there's got to be something that's changed, something that's different. So, what we did was we went across the US for several years asking kids in a high school auditorium just like this, how many of you are willing to try anything once? This came out of some study. We won't go into it, but the notion was there's something unique about kids who are willing to engage in risky behaviors. We don't know what it is, but we know that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that's the case. There are the kids that want to go on the fastest roller coaster and bungee jump and hang glide. These are the kids, we call them adrenaline kids, right? So we went across the US and asked kids, how many of you are willing to try anything once? Not drugs, but risky behaviors, bungee jumping, fast roller coaster. 94% of the kids said no, no interest. 6% said yes. So we brought those kids to our imaging center. The kids on the left are the kids who said, no interest, I have no interest in the fastest roller coaster, bungee jump, no interest. 6% said they were. That's these kids. And lo and behold, they've got about 20% more dopamine at rest than the rest of the kids. Made no sense, makes no sense. There's no reason why 2 17-year-old boys or 2 15-year-old girls have differences in the amount of dopamine in their brain. 1% or 2, maybe. 20, 25%? No way. But they did. In fact, they did. Well, then that begged the obvious question. Does it mean anything? Is it tied to their weight? Is it tied to the time of the year? Who knows what it means? So what we did was a real simple study. We have two groups of kids. The bulk, 94%, said they're not interested in engaging in risky behavior, and a small cohort said they were. Dopamine is associated with addiction, so why don't we just see what happens if we give them an addictive drug? That's what we did. We did the alcohol challenge. Pretty simple, safe, we know what we should see, reproducible. These kids took their alcohol and they got about a 4,500% increase in dopamine, which was a normal response. These kids, 52,000%. That's 10 times normal, 12 times normal. That's addiction. That's the disease right there. The kid who's got more dopamine at rest will have a response to an addictive substance 10, 12, 20 times greater than normal. Now, the beauty of working with kids is that you can talk to them, and that's what we do. So you ask these kids, you just had your shot of vodka, how do you feel? I feel sick, dizzy, want to get out of here. They describe being akathisic, but they don't, just means that they're not comfortable in their skin. These kids, how do you feel? I feel amazing, incredible. I'm relaxed, I'm not stressed. Let's do this again. This is an amazing thing. You get a response consistent with a 50,000% increase in dopamine. That's the disease. It's organic. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. The only genetic link, so the question that was asked was, is it genetic? The only genetic link we've ever seen in addiction is with alcohol. We know that if mom or dad was an alcoholic prior to the conception of the child, that about 1/3 of those kids will have the gene for alcoholism. 1/3. Only alcohol's the only thing that we've seen. Now, we have to keep something in mind. Third's a big number. 1/3 of kids born of a single alcoholic parent have the gene. If both mom and dad were alcoholics, 2/3. But we have to remember, all of us right now have the gene for blue eyes, but I'm going to bet we don't all have blue eyes. So having the gene and expressing the gene are two different things. But the only genetic link we see for this disease is with alcohol. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist for the other drugs, we just haven't seen it. So with alcohol, there's absolutely a genetic predisposition. Yeah, absolutely. So that's the disease. And it's real, it's reproducible, it's consistent, and it's predictive. We know that the single greatest way to prevent the expression of this disease is to educate kids. That comes out of the diabetes data. If you educate someone about the presence of a disease, the probability they'll engage in behavior that unmasks it is reduced by 2/3. So it means if your kid has the disease, the single greatest thing you can do is educate them about it. And the probability that they'll start to use substances that unmask it is dropped considerably. Well, the problem with this data set, when we did it, we did the whole 60 minutes thing, was the number. This is about 6% of the population. But we know the incidence of the disease is like 14%, which means we're missing some. We're actually missing half. So we went out looking for them, and in fact, they were staring us in the face the whole time. They're right here. These are kids who have normal dopamine. These are kids who have low dopamine. The manifestation of low dopamine is ADD or ADHD. We know that because we treat the disease by giving drugs that raise dopamine. So, we've got a small cohort, interestingly, 6 to 7%, that has abnormally low dopamine. Well, so we do the alcohol challenge again. And we get 4,500 here and 56,000 here. So it tells us something that's unique. It says that addiction takes two forms, making it consistent with bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, type 1 and type 2 diabetes, 9 different kinds of cognitive decline, Alzheimer's being one of them. It says there are two forms of addiction. One is the individual who's got too much dopamine at rest. The manifestation is the adrenaline kid. Or two, the kid who's got ADD or ADHD who has low dopamine. Well, because this is a clinical population, we can treat them, and we do. So we took these kids, put them on Ritalin, raised their dopamine levels back to normal, and did the alcohol challenge again, and got 4,500 here and 4,500 here. So it tells us something that's really important. It says your baseline dopamine predicts the presence or absence of the disease of addiction. Well, guess what? Your baseline acetylcholine predicts Alzheimer's. Your baseline GABA predicts Huntington's. Your baseline serotonin predicts depression. Your baseline glutamate predicts OCD. So it's not unique. It says that we've identified the neurotransmitter responsible for the disease. It takes on two forms, which provide unique behaviors. And we now know that we see it in kids before they get addicted. Well, it becomes an interesting population because we all have heard and we've all listened to the stories about Ritalin. I'm gonna medicate my kid, I'm not gonna medicate my kid. What happens to these kids who don't get medicated? They're right here. There they are. These are kids with ADD or ADHD who are not being medicated for it. What do? They self-medicate. They start to drink alcohol, smoke cigarettes, smoke a little pot, maybe use a little cocaine. They self-medicate their ADD. We know that in the disease of addiction, it's comorbid, means it exists with other CNS diseases more than 90% of the time. So now we can revisit the statement we made. We said that the reason the disease gets unmasked is because people engage in behaviors, right? Well, it turns out what really happens is the most common reason people unmask the disease is because they self-medicate another co-occurring illness, and in the process, unmask addiction. Boys, I can tell you in 43 years, I can count on two hands the number of boys I've seen who came to us because they're depressed and they want to be treated. It doesn't happen. High school boys do not seek SSRIs to treat their depression. They drink, or they smoke some pot, or they use some other drug and self-medicate. Girls, the most common is generalized anxiety disorder. Glass of wine knocks the edge off. We've all heard this a million times. So now we can make a more broad statement and a more accurate statement to say that the disease of addiction, more often than not, gets unmasked because individuals self-medicate another co-occurring illness. And in the process, unmask the disease of addiction. Well, that speaks right to the treatment world. It says the most effective strategy for treating addiction is to treat all the co-occurring illnesses at the same time. So, if you're depressed and you started to drink and now you become an alcoholic, you need to treat your depression and your alcoholism at the same time. 10 years ago, we used to pick them. You'd have a patient say, I'm depressed, I'm bipolar, I'm ADHD, and I'm an alcoholic. And you'd say, well, which of the four are we going after first? But now if you look at the data, what you find is the most effective strategy for managing addiction is to treat all the co-occurring illnesses at the same time. And it changes the game. Addiction is the most lethal disease, but it's also a manageable disease. Okay, so now we know the genesis of the disease, the origin. We know the neurotransmitter responsible. We can see it, we can measure it, we can track it, we can follow it. We can see it in people who are active users, people who haven't used yet, people who are abstinent, people who are in recovery. We can follow it. That's what we do. Now, the next piece of the puzzle is we have to be able to determine, since we're a research center and we're studying the disease, we have to be able to determine if the disease exists. The reason for that's pretty simple and economic, to be honest. We are required to compensate all our volunteers. It's not unique to us. Every research center does it, right? They either get paid or they get the research drug free, right? We have to put in some incentive to get people in. In my business, it becomes a bit of a problem because in some of our protocols, we'll pay volunteers $5,000. $5,000 is a lot of money. And it's a lot of money that people will manipulate the system to get. So it's not uncommon for us to have people who say, I'm a cocaine addict, give me my $5 grand and I'll do a PET scan. That's a problem, right? We have to make sure you have the disease. So we needed to come up with a way, objectively, to see it. So we took advantage of Pavlov. In a nutshell, Pavlov is conditioning, the dog, meat, bells, the whole bit. The predicate is pretty simple. And it says, if you truly have the disease of addiction, then when you see the substance to which you are addicted, see it, a visual cue. Not smell it, not taste it, not touch it, see it. Then your dopamine system will react as if you took it. No mystery to that, right? We live our lives with conditioned responses, right? When I smell French fries, my mouth waters, right? And when I see Brussels sprouts, I want to puke. I'm not a Brussels sprouts fan. So we took advantage of Pavlov. We went out and we got a whole bunch of kids, thousands of them. And these kids were high school kids smoking pot. The protocol was a simple one. They had to be smoking pot at least twice a week. They could have been smoking pot 7 days a week, but at least twice. We brought them to our imaging center and we measured their brain dopamine. Then we showed them a photograph of an addictive substance they're not using, in this case tobacco. No change. But when we showed them a photograph of pot, up went their dopamine. Right? Consistent, cue-triggered response, the number one cause of relapse to drug-seeking behavior are triggers, people, places, and things. No mystery to this. It even has a clinical utility. Friday, we study our opiate patients. We do not want them coming to our center in withdrawal. They don't sit still on the camera, they're ornery, they're just not pleasant. But you know they do. So how do we get them out of withdrawal? We let them call their dealer and set up a score for the next morning. And all of a sudden their withdrawal goes away. Right? People get high on the way to scoring their dope. That's a clinical response to a triggered event. They get an increase in dopamine that puts them out of withdrawal. So it's got clinical utility. That's how relevant this is. Then we took a cohort of these kids, and we asked them, when you come to the center for the study, bring with you a photograph of the person you get high with. If you get high with your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your significant other, whatever, bring a picture. More than half the kids brought photographs of their parents. I kid you not. We thought it was a joke. Most of the kids we were dealing with were getting high with their folks. I hear this all the time. But okay, it is what it is. 16. So we reproduced the study. Baseline, there's the pot triggered response. There's the photograph response. So it says something we've known forever. Cues are the number one cause of relapse. And one of the most powerful cues is the person you're getting high with. So it speaks to this whole notion that if your kid's getting high with his or her buddies, they need to be away from his or her buddies. That's why people who go to treatment centers, who are away from their cues, do better, meaning remain abstinent longer than people who don't. So one of the things that we know, there's no mystery to this, it's not controversial, is the most important thing you can do in the recovery process is to get away from the triggers. Get away from the cues. Don't hang out with the kids you get high with. So things I hear from kids, music, they get high listening to music, they get high in a place, right? We did another study, bring me a photograph of the place. You're getting high at the beach, getting high in a 7-Eleven parking lot, bring me the photograph. We got the same response. Get high in your basement, bring me a picture of your basement. So there's no mystery to this. People, places, and things are the number one cause of relapse. Cues. We see it. We measure it. We know it's real. We know it's reproducible. We know it's drug specific and cue specific. The number one cause of relapse are these triggers that we can see. Okay. Impossible. Right. When mom and dad are the triggers, impossible. Right. I'm in the city, yeah. NYU. Yeah, impossible. Right? And the other thing that we always talk about is when we have alcoholics, it is not to their benefit to have other people in the house continuing to drink. If dad's an alcoholic, it doesn't help dad to go home and the wife is having a cocktail, right? We say this all the time. These triggers are really important, and we need to respect their power, right? It always amazes me because people will say, the trigger, that's BS. It's not BS, it's real. And triggers are strikingly powerful. They're life essential. If you don't drink water in a day or two, the triggers are so powerful, they will make you drink. So these people who say, well, just ignore the cues. It's not that simple. Cues are strikingly powerful. They keep you alive. The reason you drink water is because you're cued. Think about not drinking water for 2 days. That's how powerful these cues can be. Okay, the next thing we needed to look at was this whole thing about incidents. When I was in medical school, a long time ago, medical school was 4 years, I lost 3 patients. That's less than a patient a year. Today I lose 12 patients an hour. Every hour of every day I lose 12 patients. Half of them aren't using any drugs. They're just in the room with someone who is. So we needed to go out and look at what's causing these triggers. What's causing this increased rate? We had been hearing about these games, Fortnite and Minecraft, for a long time. And then all of a sudden, Canada, our friend to the north, decided to sue the creators of Fortnite, alleging that Fortnite was as addictive as cocaine. Now, they can make all kinds of allegations. You can allege anything you want. But when you get into court, you got to prove it. So they came to us, and they asked us, the creators of Fortnite, to measure the addictive liability of the game. They said, we know the game's addictive. Interestingly, 2 of the 4 people who created Fortnite are addiction psychiatrists like me. And they readily admit, we made the game addictive. We put artificial intelligence in it. We added to the roulette conundrum. It's an addictive game. We know that. We admit it. Because there's nothing illegal about selling addictive things, right? Look at a liquor store. But when you get to really addictive, really is kind of a funny word, the legality starts to change. So they said, look, show us how addictive this game is. So it was an easy study. There's no mystery to it. We decided to look at the addictive liability of these games. Keep in mind that the DSM-5, the book that we use to classify addiction, now classifies internet gaming addiction as a DSM-5 criteria. Internet gaming is an addictive behavior that's part of the DSM-5. That's how strong this data set is. So we decided to look at the addictive liability, and it's really simple. We took advantage of what we've been doing with Pavlov. If I take the most addictive drug out there, methamphetamine, and I take 12-year-olds who are using it. A 12-year-old who uses methamphetamine, his or her dopamine levels will go up about 1.5 million%. If I take that same kid and I show them a photograph of meth, their dopamine will go up about 52,000%. That's the cue-triggered response. Mind you, that's bigger than the drug of alcohol itself and around the size of pot with respect to the effect. That is, the cue-triggered response to meth is greater than the effect of THC itself. That's how addictive methamphetamine is. So, I take the 12-year-olds, show them meth, 52,000%. Now I take 12-year-olds who are playing Fortnite. I show them Fortnite, 96,000%. That's 4 times cocaine, twice meth. That means these games have the addictive liability 2 times greater than the most addictive substance we've ever seen. They subsequently settled out of court. These games are strikingly addictive. We look at, in my business, gateways. When I was in med school, the gateway was pot. If you smoke pot today, you're using dope in a month. It's not true, never was true, but it was always said to be true, and everyone said it was the gateway drug. the most powerful gateway we've ever seen are these games. If we start to look at data, in a typical high school graduating class in the US, 6% of the graduates suffer from addiction, 6%. 99% of them are overweight, so their addiction is food, not chemical substances. But if I look at kids who started playing Fortnite in 11th grade, 19% of those kids graduate chemically dependent. That's a 20-fold increase from control. Yeah. This whole thing now with the gambling on your iPhones changed the game. We could spend the rest of our careers with those games if we wanted to. I have kids gambling in the camera. When I want to get a measure of their dopamine, they're making bets. Nightmare, absolute nightmare. And that's just getting worse, right? Columbia University is now starting a pet center looking at internet gambling, just because there's so many kids. Okay. So, we met with these guys. When we met with the guys, they said to us, you know, if you want to make something addictive, you combine it with something that's addictive. So what did they do? They released Fortnite on a cell phone platform. Well, we know cell phones are addictive. There's no mystery to it. One of the unique things about cell phone addiction, though, is it's blind to age, right? We always make the statement that the younger you are, the higher the probability of addiction. Cell phones are blind to age. That is, mom and dad are just as addicted to their cell phones as their kids are. So, I just thought this was giving your kid a smartphone is like giving them a gram of cocaine, right? We have kids going to detox for their cell phones. Again, no mystery to this. But we know that if you're playing an addictive game like Fortnite on your addictive platform, you get addicted sooner. Okay, then the question comes up, well, how do kids transition? If this is the true gateway, and we know the biggest thing that's got us concerned is younger and younger kids are playing Fortnite, right? I have kids in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade playing. How do kids transition? Well, most kids will transition from a behavioral addiction to a chemical through caffeine. When I was a kid in the 60s, coffee was an adult drink. It just was. Today, it's not. If you just look at the dynamics, the demographics of cocaine, of caffeine, now the most common exposure time is 3rd grade. When I go to elementary schools in the fall, every other kid's got their spiced pumpkin latte from Starbucks, right? No mystery to that. So we wanted to look at the effects of caffeine on the human brain. So we went out and we got our kids again, 16-year-old kids, about 4,500 of them, brought them to our imaging center on a Monday morning and scanned them. And that's their brain, normal brain for 16-year-old kids, Monday morning. Then we gave these kids a can of Monster. The intent was to give them coffee, but I couldn't convince the IRB, the Internal Review Board, that the coffee wouldn't be too hot and burn their mouths. You know, the whole McDonald's lawsuit BS. So they said no. We said we're going to give them iced coffee, not good enough. They said give them an energy drink, which was actually a better idea because it's more controlled. So we gave them Monster, 245 milligrams of caffeine, about 3 cups of coffee. So they had their Monster, they drank their Monster, they had 30 minutes, and we took another picture. And that's their brain after an acute dose of caffeine. There isn't a drug out there that we've studied that does that to the human brain like caffeine does. Cocaine doesn't, methamphetamine doesn't, heroin doesn't. All the derivatives of speed or methamphetamine and amphetamines don't. There isn't a drug out there that does this. This response is unprecedented. This is what happens for an acute dose of caffeine. Caffeine binds to what are called adenosine receptors. They are ubiquitous. They're in all parts of your brain. So it makes sense. Your brain activates, right? I drink coffee every morning because I have a 2.5-hour commute on the LIE from the East End. I want my brain like this on the LIE, not like this. Because when it's like this, I give the finger to 30 people who cut me off in the HOV lane, right? But so that's the response. It's an abnormally high response. It's not a safe response. It's okay if you're a 6-year-old boy, but it's not okay if you're a 17-year-old. That metabolic rate is too high. But okay, it is what it is. Here's what we didn't expect. We had the kids come back the next day, Tuesday. Didn't give them anything. Took another picture. And there's their brain. It answered a question for us right away. It tells us why the disease progresses. Consider, I get up Monday morning and my brain looks like this. And I drink my coffee and my brain looks like this. I now go to work. I work for the day. I come home Monday night, go to bed. Wake up Tuesday morning, I feel like this. But my brain is like this. And what do? I drink more coffee. Right? So the reason the disease progresses is because the brain doesn't have the time to recover from the previous exposure before you're introducing the next dose. Every drug has a unique temporal profile. Caffeine is the fastest. A single dose will change your brain for about 48 hours. Yep, it's acute withdrawal. Yep. But drugs like nicotine, 55 days. You get exposed to nicotine, your brain's changed for almost 2 months. Cocaine, 16 to 18 days. Pot, 18 to 20 days. Alcohol, 10 to 12 days. You get the point. If you only used your addictive substance when your brain's metabolic rate was normal for your age, then the addictive liability is markedly reduced. But we don't. We drink coffee every day, so the brain never recovers. People don't drink alcohol once every 12 days. They drink it far more frequently, so the brain never recovers. So the reason the disease progresses is because of the time interval that you're using the substance. A kid who's playing Fortnite for 15 minutes changes his metabolic rate for 14 days. So a kid who plays the game for 15 minutes, their metabolic rate is elevated for the next 2 weeks. Well, kids don't play Fortnite every 2 weeks. They play it all the time. So we now know why the disease progresses. There's something else. When your brain is like this, from caffeine, we have a fence around our brain called the blood-brain barrier, BBB. It's a real fence. It keeps bad things out. If you didn't have it, you'd go outside and in 2 hours you'd be dead because of the crap you breathe in would get into your brain and you'd have a stroke. But that's not what happens, right? Because you have this fence. Well, when your brain's like this, that fence starts to leak. That means things get in more effectively. So they made this stuff. This is 4-Loko. 4-Loko is caffeinated alcohol. This stuff is a nightmare. This stuff is a nightmare because caffeine opens the blood-brain barrier so more alcohol gets in. Caffeine allows you to drink longer because it keeps you awake. This stuff is really bad, and kids have learned how to manage this. We now have kids who pre-game parties. If they're going to a party or they're going someplace, they'll stop off and get coffee on the way. Drink their coffee, caffeinate their brain. Now they go to the party, they can use less of a substance and get higher. So caffeine facilitates or makes every other addictive compound more addictive. Okay, tobacco. In the center of all of our brains is an enzyme called monoamine oxidase, MAO. We all have it. If you consume a combustible tobacco product, a cigarette, a cigar, a hookah, pipe, chewing tobacco, you consume tobacco, you destroy your MAO. It's no mystery, it's not complicated. Right, here's a 17-year-old volunteer, normal MAO. 1 puff on a cigarette, 3 puffs, 1 cigarette, 3 cigarettes. Here's a 16-year-old girl, here's her MAO. We put her in a room, and we filled the room with secondhand smoke. And she lost it too. So there isn't any one of us here who hasn't lost this enzyme because we've all been exposed to secondhand smoke. The good news, it comes back. It takes 2 months, but it comes back. So if you smoke for 50 years and quit, in 2 months it comes back. The bad news, it's the enzyme that regulates how much dopamine you have in your brain. If you don't have it, dopamine levels rise. What does that mean? Well, first thing it means is smoking cigarettes makes every other addictive drug more addictive. Well, we've known that from the demographics. But there's something more insidious. Remember when we were looking at the disease of addiction? The first type 1 were kids who had too much dopamine. 94% said they wouldn't engage in that behavior, normal dopamine. You take that 94%, the kids who have normal dopamine, no interest in engaging in risky behavior, and you take them all to a party and you expose them to secondhand smoke. They don't do anything. They're just sitting at a party, hanging out, talking to each other, not using any substance, but breathing in secondhand smoke. In about 30 minutes, they lose their MAO. As a consequence, in about 45 minutes, their dopamine levels start to rise. In about an hour, their dopamine level is at the same level of the kids who have the disease. And now all of a sudden, they say, you know what the hell, I'll try it. The single greatest predictor for first-time drug use in kids who have expressed no interest in engaging in risky behavior is the presence of secondhand smoke. Secondhand smoke changes monoamine oxidase, which raises dopamine to a level consistent with the disease. So then if the kid says, I'm going to try, what the hell, I'll try it, and they do, they'll have that 52,000 response compared to the 4,500. Right? So we now know that the single greatest predictor for first-time drug use is secondhand tobacco smoke. It's a nightmare. So what was the solution? The solution was vaping. The theory was pretty simple. We got to get rid of this MAO effect. The MAO effect's a nightmare. And we got to get people to stop smoking. We lose 450,000 people a year to smoking. So vaping came along. If you vape nicotine, you don't lose MAO. So that worked. Kids who vaped nicotine do not lose MAO. Transitioning from people who are smoking cigarettes to vaping, not so effective, about 2%. Not zero, but not terribly effective. But we know what's going on with vaping. We're losing kids, 24,000 last year. This is Dylan. Dylan was vaping for about 2 years. He died, and we took his lungs out. This is a piece of his lung. In this slide, you shouldn't see one single dot. I'm not saying you should just see 10 dots. You should see no dots. But all you see are dots. These are oil droplets. Every kid who vapes, independent of what they're vaping, is filling their lungs with oils. We cook with oils. I sprayed the pan this morning to make my eggs with oils, right? Oils are safe. We eat them. We cook with them. We even dip our bread in them, right? Because we have an organ called a liver that makes a compound called bile that's stored in a gallbladder that emulsifies fats. You have an organ that makes a specific compound to manage fats and oils. But when you put those oils in your lung doesn't have access to bile. So the oils stay. Yep. So what does it mean? It means that every single person who vapes is putting oils in their lungs. Doesn't matter what you're vaping, right? Water has plant oils. Oils are fine to eat, but they're not fine to breathe. If you vape today, the oils you get in your lungs today are going to be there in 30 years. The more you vape, the more oils you put in your lungs. The more oils you put in your lungs, the higher the probability of lipoid pneumonia. That's what's killing kids. And it's independent of what they vape. This notion that I have kids say, yeah, but I'm only vaping juices. That's all it takes. And kids who are vaping THC oils are getting it much worse. But the other thing that's coming out now is the physics. So in a nutshell, when you vape, vaping devices are metal. When you vape, the metal fractures in the vaping device. The metal is an alloy of nickel, chromium, and cadmium. Those metals come off as nanoparticles. They go right through your lungs and they get trapped in your kidneys. Kids who are vaping are killing their kidneys. And what happens is once you start to damage your kidney, the damage is irreversible. Just like the lungs. Those metals get chelated, which is a fancy word for locked in place, and it's killing their kidneys. So I'm always asked, what's worse? Smoking cigarettes or vaping? Well, the answer comes down to what does worse mean. If worse means death, we lose 500,000 people a year to tobacco, so tobacco's worse. But if worse means chronic illness, vaping's worse. Because we all know the 95-year-old person who smoked for 70 years and they're 95, alive and thriving. You're not going to have that with kids who vape. They're going to lose their kidneys way before that. Kidney disease is on a rise as a consequence of vape at unprecedented levels. If you vape, those metals are going into your kidneys where they will stay for the rest of your life. Next. Oops. Now what did I do? Okay. I did something. There we go. Okay. Let's get past the whole COVID thing. Let's go to pot. Whoops. Yeah. Yeah. So pot. We'll cut right to the chase. THC is a potent inhibitor of mitosis. Mitosis is cell division. During adolescence, the adolescent brain is growing, undergoing mitosis. If you smoke pot during adolescence, you arrest the front part of your brain from growing. So when we talk about safety for THC, we have to put it in perspective of age. THC in an adolescent brain stops growth. So that's not safe. THC in the adult brain doesn't stop growth because the brain stops growing when you're no longer adolescent. This is the frontal lobe of 8th graders smoking pot. The yellow is where mitosis has stopped. A single hit or a single dose of THC will stop mitosis for up to 18 days. So if you're smoking pot with a frequency greater than every 18 days, your frontal lobe isn't growing. So we always make the same analogy. If you start smoking pot at 15 and quit when you're 25, at 25 you'll have a frontal lobe that's got the density of a 15-year-old. Over the next 10 years, it'll catch up, but it tells us we need to look at the safety thing with respect to age. THC in the adolescent brain is a different beast than THC in the adult brain. Edibles. We have more kids overdosing on edibles than every other drug combined, right? They eat a handful of gummies, feel nothing. Eat more, feel nothing. Eat another bag, feel nothing. And then in 2 hours it hits. Because remember, route of administration is just as important as the drug itself. So, when you smoke pot, THC is in your brain in seconds. When you eat it, it's 2 hours, 2.5 hours. So what happens is kids eat a whole bunch, feel nothing, then all of a sudden it hits, and they lose consciousness. We have more date rape from this than we ever had with roofies, because people pass out. Okay, alcohol. So we know alcohol, it's all about route of administration, how you get it in. My daughter's roommate in college doing a funnel. My son, when he was in high school, told me he didn't drink. He's in this picture playing beer pong in high school. Eyeballing is now the #1 drinking game. It's become very, very common. We see it every day. Kids are putting alcohol into their system through their eyes. This is where I go out of my way to tell kids, you know, I don't tell you what you're going to do, you're going to hear it from your parents. Don't do this. This is really bad. In the last 8 years that we've been tracking this, we've had a 216% increase in blindness. Kids are losing their sight. This is becoming more and more common. Catching up with that is tamping. Tamping is exactly what you think it is, but it's more common in guys than it is in girls. In girls, it can cause infertility. In guys, it can cause fatality. The colon dries out. People die of sepsis. This is what alcohol does to the human brain. Normal brain, drunk brain. When you consume alcohol, you lower your metabolic rate. So your whole brain slows down. It doesn't recover for about 12 days. If you continue to drink, you end up here. These are 3 groups of volunteers, normal controls on the left, alcoholics who haven't had a drink in over 20 years. You see what happens. The longer you continue to drink, the more permanent is the change in your brain. These people's metabolic rate is permanently reduced. And the only way to get it back to normal is to get drunk. These are alcoholics who are drunk when I took the picture. Their PET scans are normal. If you ask alcoholics why they drink, the number one answer is they drink to feel normal. They don't drink to get drunk. This is exactly what we see. The younger you are when you start drinking, the sooner you become an alcoholic, the greater the damage. My 4th graders are already here. And they haven't been drinking a year. So, we know that the treatment for this disease is difficult because as people drink, they feel normal. So they feel as if the alcohol is self-medicating the disease. We know that's not the case. We know the more they drink, the worse this gets. K2 is spice, synthetic pot. Don't see as much of it out here as we used to. We see more of it in the city. K2, it's synthetic pot. It produces a profound decrease in the frontal lobe that's permanent. Frontal lobe is your personality, it's your impulse control. Strikingly dangerous drug because it's so toxic. Spice kills neurons on contact. And the manifestation is people become strikingly paranoid and agitated. The most dangerous person for an officer or policeman to deal with is someone high on K2 because they're paranoid, which already instills anger, and they're agitated. Really that dangerous drug. Ecstasy. Ecstasy kills serotonin cells. This is serotonin in a normal 16-year-old brain. This is a 16-year-old kid, really nice kid, who was using ecstasy. It's destroyed his serotonin system. About 2 weeks after this image was taken, he committed suicide. This is his brain serotonin. This is what it should look like. This is his. Molly is the most lethal drug with respect to suicide. Number 1 cause of suicide in high schools is usually ecstasy-induced depression. Can't be treated, patients are refractory, nothing seems to work. Molly is, now the first thing kids will say to me is, you know, Molly was prescribed. Right, it was. Not anymore, but in the early 70s it was. Not anymore. It was used in young married couples who were having issues in their marriage. The thinking was if they both take Molly or ecstasy, they'll be more touchy-feely and more, right. Didn't work, I know, but that's what it's on the books for. Cocaine. Used to be a commercial, this is your brain on drugs. There's normal dopamine. Cocaine 1 month after use. 4 months after use, we've looked at him at 8 years, he looks just like this. Cocaine abuse causes permanent destruction of dopamine cells. Opiates. We'll cut right to the chase with opiates. Normal brain on top, this is the top part of the brain, bottom. Here's our opiate abuser. First thing you notice is the reds disappear. So the brain slows down a little bit. Not nearly as much as it did with alcohol, not nearly as much as it does with pot, but a little bit. The hallmark feature is this blue spot and that blue spot. That's a part of your brain just above your eyes called your opercular cortex. It's the part of your brain that makes you care. That's the easiest way to say it. The manifestation is I have a patient Friday and I say, look, you're gonna go score dope tomorrow. It's gonna have fentanyl in it, it's gonna kill you. And he says, I don't care. And you say, well, all right, look what it's doing to your family. I don't care. It's not that they don't care. It's that the part of your brain that allows them to care is turned off. So they're not bad people, they're not mean-spirited. It's that unique part of your cortex is turned off. And it's unique to opiates. Last drug is methamphetamine, comes in a whole host of colors. This is our daughter Brittany when she was in 7th grade. That's her dopamine system in 7th grade. This is Jennifer. Jennifer got into methamphetamine in her house and she ate it. So too did her 6-year-old sister and destroyed her brain dopamine system. Brittany and Jennifer are now 34 years old. I see Jen Every year, she's in a vegetative state, which she weighs 82 pounds. Her sister's in the same state. They destroyed their dopamine system, so they gave themselves end-stage Parkinson's disease. The risk here is that methamphetamine is really toxic, and it's the #1 contaminant in pot. If you're smoking pot, you're getting meth. That's going to mean something. That means kids smoking pot soon should start to show up with signs of Parkinson's. Well, the group in St. Louis just looked at 425 eighth graders. Smoking pot, 26% showed signs of Parkinson's disease. If you're smoking pot, you're getting meth. And if you're getting meth, you're destroying brain dopamine. You've got to destroy as much as 90% of your dopamine system to become symptomatic. So it's a thing that happens acutely, but it takes some time. So I'm going to end there. I'm happy to answer any questions about any drug we talked about, didn't talk about. Anyone got questions? So the most effective way to get something into your body is to breathe it in. Second most effective is intravenous. But if you're breathing it in, something you have a higher volume distribution, you get a higher concentration faster. And if you're vaping, even higher because now it's moist. Moist air transmits chemicals more efficiently than dry air. So smoking a cigarette, the air is dry. Vaping, the air is moist. So the analogy is pretty simple. A single hit on a cigarette versus a single hit on a vape is a factor of 20 less. Or vapes are 20